Shortly after noon on June 26, 1976, Air France flight number 139, originating in Tel Aviv, after a stop in Athens, Greece, was airborne on its final leg to a flight that ended in Paris. However, 35 minutes later, the plane had been hijacked and was now headed to its new destination in Uganda, where 105 hostages would be hosted by Field Marshal Dr. Idi Amin. The hijackers' demands were this: either release 40 terrorists being held in Israeli prisons or 14 other terrorists being held in other parts of the world, or we will kill all of the hostages. Anyway, as the world watched the story unfold, the news reports coming out about it over the next week, while formal diplomatic negotiations were taking place, behind the scenes in Israel, the Prime Minister and other government leaders, using intelligence and reconnaissance collected by Mossad, which is their CIA counterpart, they agonized over a desperate decision they had to make. At 11:03 p.m., July 3rd, after being airborne for 7 hours and only 30 seconds behind in their plan, the first of 4 Hercules aircraft touched down on the long asphalt runway at Entebbe in the Entebbe International Airport in Uganda. Scant minutes later, the IDF, which was a small elite Israeli commander unit, got out of the plane and, in what was termed the code name Operation Thunderball, after entering the terminal in only 15 seconds in lightning speed, killed all of the terrorists and released the hostages with only a few casualties. At 11:43, 40 minutes later, the 4 planes took off and roared down the runway and were aloft, which was after having just completed the longest commando raid in history. It certainly was a night the hostages would all remember. Well, there was another night some 3,500 years ago that would be remembered as well. Remembered because of the great deliverance that would take place. We're going to commemorate it by celebrating the night to be observed 2 weeks from now on Friday evening, the 19th. What is it? What does it mean? What and why is it observed, and how? CJ touched a little bit on it. And every year we rehearse this for any new members and review it as a matter of course for the rest of us, even though for the most part the majority of us are probably pretty familiar with the story by now. The night to be observed takes place yearly and is always celebrated on the beginning of the first day of unleavened bread, which, as we know, happens the evening before. You go back to Genesis, you're all familiar with the evening and the morning being the first day, so it takes place in the evening. It commemorates the deliverance of Israel leaving Egypt. You know, if you think about it, for the Israelites, it must have been a night of apprehension. They were excited about leaving, but they also were, they'd made their home for years in the fertile Nile Valley, And that's what they were used to. However, with everything happening, with the plagues taking place, and everything relating to that, and they, of course, were familiar with what was going on, they're now setting off for parts unknown en route to the land that had been promised to their fathers. As a review, we're all familiar with the story of Joseph, the pinnacle that Israel had reached when he was second in command only to Pharaoh, until centuries later we find them in severe bondage, working 7 days a week with no respite. So there'd been quite a decline in their popularity over the years. You're all familiar with the story of Moses and Pharaoh and the plagues. And so let's break into a part of the story in Exodus 12. And this will overlap with some of the scriptures that CJ used. Exodus 12, beginning in verse 15. 7 days shall you eat unleavened bread. Even the first day you shall put away leaven out of your houses. For whosoever eateth leavened bread, from the first day until the 7th day, that soul shall be cut off from Israel. So here were specific instructions as to what they needed to do. Verse 16. And in the first day there shall be a holy convocation. And in the 7th day there shall be an holy convocation to you. No manner of work shall be done in them, save that whichever every man must eat. That only may be done of you. So cooking food was okay. I remember in the early days when I was attending Ambassador College that it goes back quite a long ways. We were told that one of the men who later became an evangelist and was kind of setting the standard for some of the things taking place there, that they would cook their breakfast the night before, Friday night, or before sunset, and then they'd eat it in the morning. Now, I don't know about you, but eating a fried cold egg didn't really appeal to me. And I don't mind cold egg whites when they're like in a potato salad where there are other things like pickles and condiments and everything to kind of overshadow that. But in any event, that's what we were doing at that time. And I think you can understand, unless you've got a real affinity for white egg whites, how delicious that was. Continuing on, though, in Exodus 12, verse 17, you're able to cook food, and you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. For in this selfsame day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore, you shall observe this day in your generations by an ordinance forever. It doesn't end. It doesn't stop. It will never stop. It's going to continue on. Verse 18. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at even, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 1st and 20th day of the month at even. So these are pretty clear, precise instructions. You can't misunderstand where and when you keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And verse 19, 7 days shall there be no leaven found in your houses, for whosoever eateth that which is leavened, even that soul shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he be a stranger or born in the land. So there was no exclusion at all for, or distinction between strangers and people born there. Everyone observed it. Verse 20, you shall eat nothing leavened in all your habitations. Excuse me, shall you eat unleavened bread. Continuing on in this, let's jump ahead to verse 29, where we see the event preceding this in the chronology of the story. Verse 29, and it came to pass that at midnight the Lord smote all of the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sat on his throne unto the firstborn of the captive that was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of cattle. So even cows weren't immune to God's sword. Verse 30, and Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. A number of years ago, and some of you may have seen it, the movie that was very, very popular, won a number of awards in the year that it came out. Cecil B. DeMille was the one behind it. It showed in the Ten Commandments, it showed the evening where the death angel visited that house, and they did it in a form, and of course this is Hollywood. It was kind of a stream of, it looked like fog, I guess is the best way you could describe it, kind of going through the rooms, kind of an eerie, ethereal type of thing. And that, presumably according to them, was how the firstborn were killed. Now, you know, it doesn't say there were angels going through the houses wielding swords. I'm not sure exactly how they were killed, but they died. And anyway, in verse 31, Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, rise up, get you forth from among my people, both you and the children of Israel. And after all of the times you've been talking about and all of the requests you've made about serving your God, go and serve the Lord, as you've said. I'm going to let you go. Also, take your flocks and your herds, everything you own, and you have, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. Now, the audacity of him to ask a question like that, it's kind of humorous in a way. He's, after all of the things and all of the times that I have told you I was going to do something and then reneged on it, now you're asking me to bless you. That was what maybe was going through Moses' mind, and it doesn't say whether he blessed him or not. But anyway, it kind of tells you where Pharaoh is coming from. Verse 33, and the Egyptians were urgent upon the people that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we be all dead men. You know, it was the firstborn the first time around. Maybe the second time it'll be the next in line, the secondborn or the thirdborn, until there's no one left. And that's why they were pretty excited about getting rid of this problem. And that's why Pharaoh was a little more lenient in making a decision about letting them leave. You know, there goes all of our free labor. Now what are we going to do? They had gotten used to this lifestyle of having these slaves do all of their bidding, doing all of their work. And now they were no longer going to have the advantage of having them around. Anyway, verse 34, and the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading troughs being bound up in their clothes upon their shoulders. And the children of Israel did according to the word of Moses, and they borrowed of the Egyptians jewels of silver and jewels of gold and raiment or clothes. And this borrowed, it wasn't like your neighbor comes over to borrow your lawnmower and hopefully you'll get it back before the end of the season, get a chance to use it yourself. It wasn't this kind of borrowing. They didn't expect to get any of what they loaned, quote unquote, to the Israelites, the family heirlooms, the family silver, the family gold. It was out the door. Get out of here. That's how much they wanted them out. Verse 36, and the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they lent unto them such things as they required, and they spoiled the Egyptians. That word lent is interesting. It is Strong's H7592. If you want to look at it, Strong's H7592. It's spelled S-H-A-A-L, Sha'al, I guess. And it means to ask. Where it says they lent, they in effect were asking them for whatever they wanted. It wasn't the way we think of lend. You know, I'm going to lend you this and I expect something back. They knew it wasn't coming back. This, you can see this word used in another context, which explains that a little more succinctly. Hannah, Elkanah's wife, who had been barren for all of her life, was finally blessed with a son, and named Samuel, after she'd made the following promise to God. And you can find this in 1 Samuel 1, verse 28. 1 Samuel 1, verse 28. Therefore, also I have lent, and here's this Strong's H7592, I've lent him to the Lord. As long as he liveth, he shall be lent, 7592 again, to the Lord. She didn't expect to get him back. That's what this lent word implies. She knew that once he was in God's service, that was it. And in 1 Samuel 2, verse 20, 1 Samuel 2, verse 20, and Eli, who was the priest, blessed Elkanah and his wife Hannah, and said, the Lord give thee seed of this woman for the loan which is lent, and here again, H7592, to the Lord. And they went unto their own home. And verse 21, and the Lord visited Hannah so that she conceived and bare 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the child Samuel grew before the Lord. So she got a 5-for-1 return on her gift. She lent Samuel to the Lord. But it wasn't like she expected anything back, but she got 5-for-1. Anyway, going back to Exodus 12, verse 37, I'm going to just read this one verse on the, from the NIV. Exodus 12, verse 37. The Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Sukkot. There were about 600 men or 600 men on foot, besides women and children. King James omits women, but this translation has it. And if you think about it, you're not going to have 600 bachelors as part of this group. There obviously were families, there obviously were children involved as well. So this 600 figure can swell to easily over 1 million. and perhaps even more, because it said in verse 38, and a mixed multitude went up also, besides the men, the women, the children, and their flocks, their herds, even very much cattle. Now, the reason that I'm dwelling on this is to give you a little better idea of the logistics involved in this move. This wasn't like saying to your children, particularly your teenagers maybe, we're going to church today. And then a half hour later, you're still trying to get them out to the car. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever experienced that with your children. I know I did in the past, especially my two oldest daughters. They, of course, it was a little different scenario, and the children probably were pretty obedient after knowing what was going on, but still, you'd have older people, the aged, you'd have people who were infirmed, who couldn't just get up and, grab a stick and start hoofing it down the road. You had people helping them, and that's the mixed multitude. They probably were servants, there were slaves, whatever. And then they also were moving the flocks of animals as well. So the death angel passed over at midnight. Pharaoh had to wake up and find out what was happening around him, getting input from other people who said, we've got all these dead people. And then recognizing what had happened and realizing what had been predicted to happen. And so you go through all of this, the story of how this all came together. And so by the time they actually were starting to move, got all the flocks, all the herds, all the people, and got them dressed and on their way, what we're about to read didn't happen that night. There's no way that it could have happened. You suddenly get freed and then just sit down on your haunches and have a big meal to celebrate it. They were on their way out, and they wanted to get out as fast as they could. They baked, and this is later, after this has taken place, verse 39, and they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they brought forth out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not tarry, neither had they prepared for themselves any victual. They had been driven out of Egypt with no time for any kind of delay at all. They'd not provided themselves necessarily with food for the journey. They had so little, but when they finally took a breather, wherever this took place, however far it was from where they no longer felt in danger, they took a breather. It says, verse 40, now the sojourner of the children of Israel who dwelled in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day it came to pass that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It's a night to be much observed unto the Lord for bringing them out from the land of Egypt. This is that night of the Lord to be observed of all the children of Israel in their generations. And that is why we observe it today. We review the dramatic and unique story of how God delivered Israel those many years ago. Egypt here is representative of sin, which we likewise are delivered from by the blood of Christ. The symbols which we take during the Passover the night before. Well, what should our focus be when we are gathered together with friends during the night to be observed? We live in a world that's replete with fake news. We live in a world where trying to be truthful and righteous is seldom part of people's mantra. What lesson did God teach the Israelites during all of this? Well, one certainly was to look to him for deliverance, which is what we all have to do. And they certainly were given favor in the sight of the Egyptians, since they definitely went out of Egypt with a high hand. When we celebrate the night to be observed, we once again acknowledge with thanksgiving the memorial each year that takes place the night before at the Passover, when the great sacrifice that Jesus made for all of us is once again acknowledged by us. We go through the symbols, recognizing the importance, what it means to us. This sacrifice is one that enables us to be forgiven continually for all of our imperfections, our sins, our shortcomings. We acknowledge that we've been freed from our Egypt of sin and are able to celebrate with joy and thanksgiving the forgiveness we have received because of Christ's sacrifice for us. As we celebrate the first annual Holy Day of 2019, we give thanks for the relief we receive from having a burden of guilt we sometimes carry around on our backs lifted from our shoulders. We eat unleavened bread with joy after having removed all of the leaven from our homes prior to this time. The leaven being symbolic of the sin in our lives. I can remember times past when we would have meetings at the Seattle Center, and this is years ago, for a banquet and catered meal for the night to be observed. I don't remember the exact number, but it was at least 1,000, and probably even more, because at times they would have all of the churches in the Puget Sound as part of the celebration. However, that proved to be a little unwieldy, and it took quite a bit of time, just the time it took to get people in and seated and served and everything, and then back out, and the parking and all that. So over the years, it's been reduced to a smaller scale. And now individual churches will meet and do what we are doing this year. And for those unable to make it, they'll meet with other brethren in their homes or in restaurants in a private room where they can have the privacy to observe it. It's good for people that know they're going to be running late or don't have a lot of time between work to run home and prepare food for a potluck. And also sometimes if there are unconverted mates involved, they can't have anything like that. Or maybe their home is too small to host a group. Or they may have health limitations. So there are a variety of reasons why you may not be able to attend at the hall in Woodinville, but there are the different options that are available if needed. The main thing is we try to observe it in an environment encompassing and supporting our goal of coming out of the world. And this year it's going to be at the American Legion Hall in Woodinville, as Mr. Holliday mentioned. Paul reminds us all that we must continue earnestly in prayer, being vigilant in it with thanksgiving, and that's found in Colossians 2, and you don't have to turn there. We live in a fascinating and yet dangerous world in which it's easy for us to be distracted and fall asleep spiritually. Perhaps in God's wisdom, the Holy Day cycle starts off with fellowship among true believers who realize the vital importance of remaining on guard, especially against a powerful fallen archangel whose only design is to hinder us from being part of the family of God. I know this year has been unusually difficult. I always find myself prior to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Passover, saying, this year it's going to be different. I'm going to plan things differently. I'm going to do something this way. And it's going to be easier than before. Oh, yeah? Each year. You know, I couldn't believe how many different things came out of the woodwork and surfaced this year, and probably there's more in the offing. You know, there are individual irritants, some major, some minor, and at times so unbelievable that Veronica and I were laughing about it a few days ago and saying, well, what's going to happen next? And I won't bore you with the details of any of them because I know you have your own, which are unique, and you and your family look at them and they far outweigh what I have to offer. So no bragging rights on what's been going on. Nevertheless, we haven't even begun to endure anything like the major events the Israelites experienced leaving Egypt, or in more recent times, the hostages that Entebbe went through on their flight to freedom. But as I said to us, the events in our own lives are more than sufficient enough to remember. When you think about the evening of the night to be remembered, there's a principle to remember which is illustrated when a chief Pharisee invited Jesus for a meal, and that's found in Luke 14:12. Luke 14:12. Then saith he, Jesus, also to him that bade him, when thou makest a dinner or a supper, call not thy friends, nor thy brethren, neither thy kinsman nor thy rich neighbor, lest they also bid thee again, and a recompense be made thee. But when thou makest a feast, call the poor, call the maimed, call the lame, call the blind, and thou shalt be blessed, for they cannot recompense thee, for thou shalt be recompensed at the resurrection of the just. Not all of these elements apply, of course, to the night to be observed, because we usually include all of the people in our congregation that fall into this category. Just remember, it is a night to be remembered. It's a night to be observed. Be sure not to forget those who are perhaps new to this region or our congregation, or are perhaps traveling through this area at this time of year. Be sure, if you know anyone who falls into any of those categories, to show them your hospitality so they can enjoy the special evening with us, regardless of where it's spent. Be sure you do your best to help them make it a night they will always remember.